Well, good evening again. And here we are. I'm Bob Graves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor. And we're back here again to chit chat about a few things. And I'm hoping that I can get some participation out of you tonight because I'm curious to know what some of your thoughts on the topic tonight would be. I want to be talking about the concept of God's will. It's a concept that I believe to be um, used in an abusive manner. I do believe that there is such a thing as God's will, but I don't think it has much to do with the things we talk about when we're talking about God's will. And I really think that many of us have invested ourselves deeply into a concept of God's will that we find it very difficult to disinvest from um, for various reasons. And I would want to even contend that I think that it inhibits our lives from becoming everything they can and should be. In fact, it keeps us from the will of God. um, the will of God is a concept that I think has developed over time with, I would argue, pernicious purposes behind it. You know, when you're running a religion and you're trying to organize an institution and you have priests or ministers and evangelists and individual churches, and you're trying to organize a united front around a theology and a creed, things which really have nothing to do with the real mission and purpose and vision of Christianity. Well, in order to do that, you are going to discover something. People need to be controlled. And you really can't control a
Hey,
sense
Bob.
of all that theology.
Hey,
You
Bob.
can't control. Hello.
Hey, this is your producer, Joey Livingston. I'm very sorry to interrupt. It sounds like you have the curse of Greg Bray this week. It's probably our computer. It's messing with your sound. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take just a quick break, about 30 seconds, move you over to the premium computer that you should have been on in the first place. I apologize, and I'm going to thoroughly thrash my assistant for doing that to you. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you're enjoying The Unconventional Pastor. We'll be back in about 30 seconds.
And evidently we're back, so that's good. Sorry for that little interruption there. Um, I was talking here about the concept of the will of God, and I was talking about the fact that I really think that many of the ideas that are currently entertained um, came out of a real pernicious need to control people. A movement that is going to be operated by an organization is going to just completely fall apart if we let everybody do what makes sense to them. And so we have to find a way of getting everybody on board, on the same page, driving with the same vision, the same mission, and the same strategies, and so forth and so on. And in order to do this, it requires coming up with a way of telling people how to think, how to make decisions, how to evaluate things. However, one of the problems the church is going to have is this. People are sooner or later going to say, well, who are you to tell me what to think? Who are you to tell me what strategies to have? Who are you to tell me what values, what vision, what mission I'm supposed to have as a Christian? Well, that's a good question. And it's such a good question that we don't want you to ask it. So we have to come up with this concept whereby You certainly can't ask God those questions. That would not be very polite. Besides, he's bigger than you are. And particularly if he's a mean guy, you could be made to suffer for such insolence as to question God in that way. And so I think that what happens is we do this bait and switch. We try to come up with a way of how we express the vision, the mission, the values, and the strategy of an organization as if this is God's will, and as if, well, this isn't our idea, and so you're not really fighting us if you're not going to play the game. You're fighting God, and how dare you do that? And the more I can teach you in a sensitive way to figure that out, the easier it will be for me to control you in that sense. Now, I think that it began in a very pernicious way, but I think it can continue in a very naive and gullible fashion. That is, I think that this concept of the will of God is sustained by very well-meaning people, people who teach it as well as people who seek it. And in doing this, I think it does a great deal of harm and damage. And of course, it helps to try to maintain this unity, which is, in my opinion, a false unity, a unity that is coerced, a unity that comes from a form of corporate, organizational, and institutional control. And not to say that God doesn't have a will, and not to say that we can't find verses that seem to talk about God having a will. But I hate to be the one to break the news to you, if you didn't realize this, that God's will doesn't seem to me to be anything close to what it is many people talk about it being. There's another reason why it exists, not just perniciousness on the part of those who develop the concepts as a form of control. But I think that it also, and as I said, the gullibility of people who mean well. The truth is, none of us come into life knowing what to do. If we're ever going to know what to do, it's going to be a guess. And by trial and error, we can come up with better guesses. By developing even certain scientific approaches to life, we can come up with a better way of envisioning what we want to be. We can come up with a better sense of what values are really important. We can come up with a sense of purpose. We can develop these things in our life. But if we're each left to our own devices, we're each going to develop these in a very different way. And in fact, we do, which makes maintaining this control a little difficult. But we come into this world not knowing. And we come into this world oftentimes failing at some of these trial and error periods. And sometimes failure can hurt. Sometimes we can hurt each other by shaming each other for the failures that we have when we really shouldn't. Failure isn't really a horrible and bad thing. It's just, an expected outcome wasn't achieved in the way one thought it might be. And this is not really failing. This is just discovering and eliminating an option that you now know better than to choose. And there are so many options that failure is one of the very successful methods for discovering what options to cross out. And when you begin to notice certain themes that appear in some of those options that you've had to cross out, you can now start to cross out a lot more options without ever having to try them. I think of, I don't know if it's a true story or not, but it's often told that Thomas Edison cataloged all of his experiments in attempting to create the incandescent light bulb. And when he had crossed the line with experiment number 1000 and still hadn't created an incandescent light bulb, he was chided by some, so the story goes. It may be true or not, I don't know, but he was chided for having failed 1,000 times. And according to the story, Edison says this not as a way of trying to save face, not as a way of trying to just look at it in a far more positive manner, but very earnestly saying, I have not failed at anything. I have isolated 1,000 specific ways this cannot be done. And when he said that, when you discover how the light bulb was eventually made, the incandescent light bulb, you can see various features in the light bulb that was finally invented that were part of all those little failures. In fact, it was all those failures and a discovery of what was not working and a discovery of why it did not work that made the suggestions as to what might be necessary to make it work. The kind of metals used, how thick they were, whether or not it was going to exist inside of a vacuum, and various other features of what finally creates the light bulb. And the truth is, it's not as if he was just shooting arrows into the air and finally found one that went into the target. When he finally invented the light bulb, its design was based upon a great deal of things that were learned in the process of what wasn't working. And so there's a sense in which all of those previous trials were extremely useful aspects of discovering what doesn't work, not just in inventing a light bulb, but in discovering a great number of other things that would also be true about various things that we could hook up to an electronic circuit and wouldn't work, making it a lot easier to advance from just light bulbs to other devices that would operate electrically. And so, in a sense, taking a very different look at failure in life and taking a far more positive, far more dignified view of it will allow us to move out of that realm of shame, which is a false one, that could make us to be a great deal more confident and positive about how we assess the fact that when it comes to life, living your life successfully, whatever that might mean, how do you do it? How do you do it? Well, we all have a sense, whether we want to admit it or not, that life is filled with decisions. That life seems to be filled with decisions that could be better made if I had some principles by which to make them. That I could suffer less, that I might be able to avoid certain calamities, that I might be able to provide for my family, provide for myself, or be safer in my community, or a wide variety of other possible valuable outcomes. And we all recognize this so that whether we admit it or not, we realize that to a certain degree, we may differ on what degree we think is necessary. We need to have a plan of some sort. We need to have a strategy of some sort for coming at life. And since we don't know what that is until we figure it out, and since we can suffer so much by not having it nailed down to the floor very well, along come some people willing to teach you, oh, God has a plan for your life. You can find his will and do it. Oh my God, this is wonderful. I mean, I am trying to figure out who to marry, what college to go to, what career to choose, what town to live in, what house to buy, what car to buy, whether or not I should do this, get that, make my budget this, make my budget that. And holy cow, this stuff isn't always easy to figure out. And now you're telling me God has a will for my life. This is awesome news. So the news can be so good that that you can really fall for it in a marvelous way. But it gets worse than that. We become self-pernicious. I think this is what can happen. You make a couple of good decisions. You make a couple of good decisions that way, thinking you're following God's will. Now, you don't want to be able to admit to yourself that maybe this concept of God's will is really just an illusion and a fantasy, not even really even taught, even in the Bible, not something that's a real way for planning your life. And if you're going to admit that, you're going to have to come up with a new way of understanding some of your previous decisions, that worked out well as some of your previous decisions that didn't work out well and you lied about it. You're going to have to stop lying about it, or you're going to have to stop spinning it in a certain way. For example, What if you became convinced that it was God's will that you do plan A, and you do plan A and the results are a disaster, but you've already invested yourself in this idea, well, that this is God's will. Well, if it was a disaster, and if it's obviously a disaster, what do you do with that? Do you admit to yourself, I'm looking for my clock here. I got to put my clock in here. Do you admit that and recognize that you did something that was just, a bad idea? Or do you say, well, I know it turned out to be a disaster, but I think that's what God wanted. God wanted me to go through this process because there was some lesson he wanted me to learn. Yeah, the apparent obvious purpose of the decision, that didn't work out, but God had some other angle in mind. And now you begin justifying the foolishness and the stupidity of a past decision by claiming that once you thought it was God's will, that it really was God's will, but it just had some other purpose than the obvious one. And the reason we do this is because the formula we've come up with for deciding that something really is God's will is a fake formula, but it's the only one we got. And if I'm going through that formula and I'm getting that, I have peace in my heart about this. There's nothing in my spirit that gives me any sense of unrest or dissonance. And so this is how I know it's the will of God. I have peace in my heart about it. I've prayed about it. And I think I've even seen the signs, and I've read the tea leaves and looked at the entrails and, or no, excuse me, not that part. But somehow you've come up with this formula for how it is you discern that something is the will of God. And since this is the only method you know, and it's the method other Christians are telling you, and the way that you're kind of expected, oh, you want to be a missionary. Well, is it God's will that you are a missionary? Oh, you want to do this with your life. How do you know that's God's will? Oh, you want to marry this person. You're thinking of going to college where? And have you prayed about it? And do you know that this is God's will? This, in some circles, has become a very strong way of trying to get people to, and I think sometimes people mean well by it, but many Christians will live in an environment where this concept of God's will is made very central to their decision-making process. And so they have to find some formula that seems to give them this will. And then when it doesn't, then when it works out, they confirm for themselves, see, this is really the right way to go about it. And when it doesn't work out, instead of saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem to really always work. Instead of saying that, they go, well, there must have been some other purpose. Now, I think this is going to keep you stupid. I hate to say that. It's going to keep you dumb. I have known some Christians who, sincere, lovely, sweet people in many ways, who have made certain kinds of decisions, believing it to be God's will, that had certain very specific, thematic, horrible weakness and foolishness built into it. And some of these people, 25 years later, are still making the same foolish kinds of decisions. And they're still experiencing the same horrific results. And they're just wondering how much of this God wants to teach them until he finally brings them the success they were hoping God's will would one day bring them. Some of them will go to amazing lengths. I know one fellow that I've known him since I was a teenager, and I'm 61, and he was very adamant about doing God's will, and I've known him through the years. And there was one time he actually went into a business that he believed was really God's will, and he was just convinced of it. And he got a lot of other Christians on board in his business. The problem was there were things about his particular business that the Securities and Exchange Commission has a great deal to say about how you do certain things and what must be done, what constitutes due diligence, et cetera, and there's laws. Well, he didn't see these things as consistent with what God was telling him to do, and so he kind of ignored them. And he was warned and warned and warned and warned and warned. And many times the business plans he had were falling apart. People were losing money. things weren't working the way he thought they should. And he's beginning to wonder what God is really teaching him and when a huge success was really going to pile in. And of course, it never did. But he kept on keeping on because he was going to be faithful to God. Make a long story short, he ended up going to prison. He ended up being found to have committed acts that were illegal, acts that he felt couldn't possibly be illegal, things that it took him a long time to even be able to think of as, but I didn't do anything wrong. I just did what God told me to do. In fact, in some ways, some of the things that he did that he shouldn't have been doing involved certain aspects of business decisions that he didn't even seem to understand or appreciate. Well, why do you need to do that? What good is that? I don't do anything for you. And so he's actually involved in a business that he does not possess a personal acumen for. But because of his great desire to be successful, his great desire to be faithful, and his deep commitment to this concept of God's will, he was faithful to the very end. And it turned out to be the very end. His plans went awry. And I've noticed this about a lot of people, that I've known some people who were generally smart people, generally wise people. And when they try to follow this typical formula for God's will, they make generally good decisions. And I've known some other people to be extremely foolish. And when they follow this formula for knowing God's will, it seems like God is always just as foolish as they are, no more, no less. But one thing I would claim that I think I've observed over the years. I'm in my 60s, and I've been watching this dynamic watching and observing this concept of God's will for 40 years. Appears to me that the people who are really committed to it never really grow up, never really learn how to improve in their decision making, because they're not really making decisions. They're trying to figure out what the decision is God wants them to make, without really going through the process of discovering what it means to think about something, to analyze the options, to foresee the possible outcomes, to recognize the risks involved, the costs involved, and to then make a decision in their lives that has a reasonable risk and a reasonable payoff in being able to be a doable thing that they can tackle with responsibility and passion. And so they end up going down a road that bypasses that process of natural human development and personal responsibility to become a person who can make good decisions because you've learned from your mistakes. No, they're just too busy following the will of God, going absolutely nowhere but in circles. They're not following any will. They're just following the coherence that comes from their own untrained, unlearning mind. Now, in this concept of God's will, we have God's will, as it's often taught, for the universe. What God's overall plan is for why He even has creation. God's will for mankind, the destiny that He has in mind for mankind, and specifically how that divvies us up perhaps for all eternity, or what it is we're going to be doing in this life that is somehow according to His purposes for the human race. And there's concepts of God's will in terms of how this affects Israel in particular and other nations as well. Many people like to apply that to the United States of America, God's will for our country. God's will for the church, and oftentimes that doesn't mean just the body of believers, but the institutions and organizations that people feel a necessary loyalty to, that I believe are identity thieves. There's no institution or organization on earth of any sort, Protestant, Catholic, or otherwise, that is an actual church instituted by God. There's no such thing. There is a thing called the church, but that's just people. It's just it's a living thing, and it's neither organized nor disorganized. It just is what it is, and it's only as organized as it is and as disorganized as it is, and that's quite okay, because it's defined by the life that's in it, not necessarily the strategies. Anyhow, so there's this will for the church, and then it also then, comes down to God's will for the individual. Now, I'm going to tell you this. I think you can find things in the Bible that talk about God's will, but I think we have to read into it words that aren't there. It is amazing to me how many theological doctrines people claim to be biblical that aren't even in the Bible. It's not even there. What you find in the Bible are words that seem to skirt the concept and the doctrine, and then people use these words that skirt it and say, see, there it is, it's in the Bible. The fact that you can find the phrase God's will in the Bible doesn't mean that the concept of God's will as we teach it is found in the Bible. And the concept as we teach it, that concept isn't taught. Show me in the New Testament people searching for God's will for their life. Are people looking for this mysterious thing? How many examples can you find of people actually busy doing things in the New Testament, but before they do this, they're trying to figure out what it is God has called them to do? I'll tell you, as far as I'm aware, in the Bible, everybody called to do something was busy doing other things when they were called. It's as if God's call, when it does exist, is an interruption to things they were responsibly doing until such time as they got a tap on the shoulder. But this idea of not being busy doing things responsibly on your own, passively waiting until God calls you to do something. Not only that, but when I look in the Bible, when I see the various stories there about people that were called of God to do something, I don't see that God was micromanaging their lives either. God may have called them to do one or two things in their entire life. And most of the people alive in the Bible were never called by God to do anything. David seems to be called and appointed to have become king in Israel. Well, what about the stable boys that worked in his stable? Were they called of God to be stable boys? Does the Bible teach us that? Were they searching and hunting for God's will for their life until they found, God is calling me to be a stable boy in David's stable? No, you don't see this in the Bible. That concept isn't there. What you see, anything that resembles that story, and by the way, I should probably in honesty say, I don't know that I accept all of these concepts of the Bible as being an accurate picture of what's going on, but really an accurate and authentic sharing of what appeared to be going on according to those who wrote the text. So that I would not even necessarily want us to put complete authenticity into, that's the formula. That's how you do it. No. That's the way they perceived it being done. How it really happens, who knows? But anyway, this concept of God's will and what they're going to do in their lives isn't there in the Bible, but there's words that are skirted. There's something a friend of mine said that I thought was so funny, and many comedians are very good at this. A good comedian is somebody who can tell a joke by telling you something so that all the words seem to be telling you a story, until the very last word they say changes everything you were thinking and expecting and totally changes the entire story through that one last word, showing you that up until that last word, there's more than one way that those words could have been understood, but you were led to understand them in a very specific way, but not until the funny word, that last word, comes out do you now realize the way that it was intended to kind of lead you astray. Good humor often structures its language that way, deliberately. But all language has that as a potential. You can say things that can possess an apparent, coherent set of various meanings that are not always obvious as to what all those different possible meanings might be. And this is particularly true when the obvious meaning from one culture may not be the same obvious meaning from another time and another culture that has different values, different priorities, different experiences, and different problems that they need to solve. The funny thing that this guy said was this, and he's often saying, and I should give him credit, Mike Myers. He's a very funny guy. He's a carpenter, but he could really be a comedian if he wanted to be. And sometimes he says things that just crack me up. He said this one morning. It's on his Facebook page. He said, "I'm not sure what surprised the FedEx lady more, the fact that I was at the door naked, or that I knew where she lived." Now, as you're listening to this, you're being told this story that makes it sound like the FedEx lady is at his door and that he comes to his door naked. And he's saying, I'm not sure what surprised the FedEx lady more or what upset her the most, the fact that I was naked or the fact that I knew where she lived. Now you realize, oh, wait a minute, the entire scene isn't taking place at his house. It's taking place at her house, and she's not even on the job. She's just the FedEx lady that he somehow must have been stalking. Now, when we hear a twist of words like that, it's kind of humorous and it's funny. And particularly if it's something preposterous, stupid, or maybe even a little bit risque. And we laugh. And such is the way that humor is often structured. And people who have the gift of humor can throw these things together just in a flash of their thoughts and a couple of synaptic responses, and they go crazy. And we love it and we enjoy it. But, words are capable of this kind of nuanced ambiguity. That's kind of like as if words have the ability to be like an optical illusion. Depending on how you look at it, you see something very different in the words. And so the text has been gone over by, first of all, perniciously, the clergy that wants to control the populace. And so they start to develop from these various texts, explanations, looking at different words, explaining why this preposition is here, explaining what this context means, and mean why it is you need to have peace in your heart when you're discerning, and when the Christ will rule in your heart, and through peace and all this. They come up with this story that somehow corroborates the way they're trying to get you to understand this formula for God's will for your life. And what you get taught this so often, and you begin to experiment with it, and you get so deeply involved, and they take advantage of your gullibility that after a while you start reading these verses, and that seems to be what they're saying to you. When all the while, it's not there. It's like if you never heard the last word of that funny line from Mike Myers, you wouldn't realize that this entire scene is taking place in front of the FedEx lady's house, not at your house. And so this concept of God's will gets rearranged, rewritten, rescripted, and altered in a way that ends up making you a person who, without realizing it, becomes less responsible, less mature, less capable and able to think for yourself and to take responsibility for your decisions. You can't give your decisions to God. Now, you can recognize that you live in a world that He has created. You can recognize that the mercies of reality are what they are. You can't do certain things and expect it's going to work out, because things don't work that way. And so it's not as if you can invent reality. You've got to figure out how reality is working and come up with a way of living within its constraints that gives meaning to your life. That's something you're going to have to do. But you're not going to be able to do that when you can't accept 100% of the responsibility for the decisions you make. Now, human plans require usually some sort of approach that involves, whether you stop to think about it, some sense of vision, some sense of value, some sense of mission, and some sense of strategy. Now, these are words that we talk about. Sometimes life coaches use these words. Sometimes business planners use these words. These are words we use to kind of talk about some of these sequential cognitive steps involved in coming up with a good plan for your life. Now, some people overdo this. I think they come up with the idea. I mean, it's not as if the plan for your life ought to be to become a millionaire or something like that. I don't think that's the plan of life that we should all be adopting. That may be great for some people, but not necessarily for everybody. But nonetheless, even though we might talk about it in the same business way, there is something of this sort that really is involved in the plans all of us make for our lives. There's some sort of a vision. And by that, I mean this. In order for your life to move forward, you need to be able to see the possibilities, to have a sense of what they could be, might be. Now, this is a difficult thing for many reasons. One is, first of all, you got to have a good imagination, a healthy imagination. But the other reason why it's difficult is this. I would be one of those people who would argue that you need to be satisfied with being right where you are. I mean that. In fact, and that doesn't mean you should stay where you are. I think you need to find out what it means to be satisfied with where you are and to see some place that might even be a more meaningful place to be, that you could also be satisfied. And that we make changes and move forward in life because we're going into areas that provide for us more meaning, not because we need to survive, not because there's this sense of urgency, not because I have no idea how things are going to turn out. I hope I can finally reach this milestone where I can then relax. That is a horrible way to make plans, because I guarantee you're going to be focused on the things that stress you, and you're going to just build those stressors back into exactly where you go. You know, almost 99% of people who win the lottery, win a couple $1 million in the lottery, 10 years later, just as broke as they were before they ever won the lottery. Why? They never really changed the way they think. They thought their life would be better with more money. And I suppose that for 10 years, it was a little better, but they blew it. They just blew it because they didn't understand the value of money and what it really could do and how it really could be used. And so they just spent it the way they think wealthy people do and the way wealthy people don't. Wealthy people think about money differently, and that's why they're wealthy, perhaps. Very likely. Anyway, viewer comment. Thanks for talking about this, Bob. This is a great subject and has been on my mind for a long time. Well, wonderful. I'm glad that we touched on it then. And any other comments that you may have out there, I hope you share them. And perhaps even a story or two, your own experience or the experiences you've seen in some other people. I think that in each of us, we need to have, as I was saying, this sense of a vision, a comfortable vision, a recognition of, I'm happy being me. I think it's a good thing to exist. I think people are wonderful. You can have this very genuine, positive, peaceful attitude about the way things are. Even when things aren't the way they can be, it needs to in some way be acceptable to you that if we're going to change it, we're going to change it by starting where we are. And that's an acceptable place to start. It's the only way you can come up with real plans that make real sense, that deal with things as they really are and move towards real solutions that can really change things for the better. So, in a sense, we need to have a vision, the ability to see things differently, the ability to, hey, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could, instead of the way it is now, to have it this way? Wouldn't it be awesome? The ability to have some sort of vision. And in fact, the clearer your sense of realizing that is a possibility, the better you're going to be at actually achieving such a thing. And the more wisdom you accumulate in life, the more that kind of vision, then when you have it, when you're thinking about possibilities, are going to represent something realistic instead of something kind of foolish as you spin castles in the air. And, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if next year at this time I had $6,500,000 in the bank? Yeah, that would be wonderful. But is that realistic right now? Thinking about that. And I'm just putting in terms of money because that's the kind of planning most people think about. But I mean, to be at a place where I am, where I've taken care of certain issues or certain problems, or getting certain things to happen or occur, or get out of certain issues or troubles or problems, get the mortgage paid off, make sure that I really have found myself in a career that I can work in and be happy to be involved in, or something like this. Making these kinds of plans involves being able to somehow envision it, seeing the possibility. And this is something you've got to accept responsibility for. You got to accept responsibility for the foolishness of it and the possibilities of it, the realisticness of it and the craziness of it. You've got to be able to own this as your own thinking, as your own envisioning, be it crazy, be it realistic, be it foolish, be it mature, be it immature. You need to own it as your own and deal with it as such. And we also need to take on a question of a sense of mission. That is, I think that each of us in our lives have to come up with a sense of it's good for me to be here. I wonder if there are certain, marks I can leave on life or on the people that I love that is a sign of my presence, a significant um, imprint of my presence that is really valuable and important, and something that is better having been done than not. And so each of us can sometimes benefit from having some sense of purpose or mission. I, I'm not just here to hang out until the day comes when I breathe my last, and then thank God we can move on from this hellhole. But a sense of purpose in life gives us, helps to provide us with that sense of meaning. And I think we need to accept the fact that what we think of as our meaningful purpose is what we think of as our meaningful purpose, not a meaningful purpose given to us by God, but an opportunity we have given to us by God as an opportunity to figure that out for ourselves. We need to take responsibility for what purpose it is we think we can serve and what purposes we reject as purposes we could serve. And we need to own those as our decision, as a purpose we have envisioned, as a purpose we have rejected, and as a purpose we need to think about. And we need to accept responsibility for having struggled with that idea. And people who do come to life with a sense of it's a good thing I'm here. I think I can do some things that leave this world a better place than I found it. I think I have some skills and abilities that I can bring to certain people's lives that will just improve, or help or benefit in various different ways. And when one sees this as their gift, they have a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. And I think that's a very helpful thing to have. But I don't suggest you get it from God. I suggest you get it from your own very nature, well, like God created you with, and your nature will be the plan, as it were. It will be the guide that tells you who you are, your personality, your interests, the kind of brain you have. Whether you have an aptitude for math or an aptitude for literature, an aptitude for poetry, an aptitude for humor, or an aptitude for good hard work, building things, making things, loving people, reaching out, touching lives, touching hearts. Whatever it is you seem to possess some natural skills toward, learning to develop them and hone them, and having a sense of purpose about it. So it can give you meaning in life. But it's your responsibility to figure this out. Don't ask for God to give you any shortcuts here. There are no shortcuts, and you don't need any shortcuts because you are more than adequate just being you in allowing who you are to make these things obvious as you take responsibility for them over time. And guess what? If you're not really there yet, it's perfectly wonderful and acceptable if you move towards that from where you are. That's perfectly fine. With a sense of vision and mission, I think you also need to recognize that we all have to have certain values. Do you lie? Do you not lie? Do you care about everybody or nobody? Just family, country, uh, people in your political party? You need to come up with some values that help you make certain decisions, that make you realize, well, I have 10 options here, but the truth is 6 of them involve doing something that I'm not comfortable with what that says or what it seems to violate values that I hold. And I think we all need a sense of values. These help us to discern options, not just in terms of, well, what's going to get me where I need to go, but is it really good to get there that way? And there's some places that might be good to get to, but if you can't get to them in a legitimate manner, yeah, maybe that's an option you need to forego, a destiny you need to decide is unrealistic or inappropriate. We have another viewer comment here. The search for the will of God seems to have been a gateway leading to bondage of self-righteousness for many throughout history. And it looks to me like more is being written. I would totally agree with this. And we got more. We got another comment coming. I can see the little squiggly pencil there tells me that a comment is being written. Until it gets there, I'll continue on. Oh, here it is. Okay. Viewer comment. Great topic, great show, Bob. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And more comments. Hope you can bring them in. We only have about like 5 more minutes before the show ends. Anyhow, after all of these, when you have a sense of the possibilities, a clear sense of what could be instead of just what is, while having a real comfort about what is, and that getting to someplace else might be an even better idea. When you have a sense of mission, a sense of purpose, a sense of your giftedness that you can bring to the world, and excuse me, I got a call that I really can't take, so just let it go. Yeah, just let it go. Somebody doesn't know I'm broadcasting now, and I'll have to call them later. Anyhow, see, we do this thing live. It's off the cuff. In as we have that sense of mission, as we have that sense of purpose, as we then compare it with our values, we now have a rubric upon which we can, make decisions as to what we want to do, and then also make decisions on, so how do we get there? What are the steps we need to take to get there? And that's what you might call your strategy, whether you want to call it strategy or this and that. But everybody has a way of approaching life that involves a strategy. I mean, when we're talking about even making breakfast, your strategy might be, get up out of bed, get into the kitchen, open up the cupboard, find the box of cereal, locate a bowl somewhere, these are steps. It's kind of like a strategy to get yourself breakfast. And whether you want to call it that or not, it doesn't matter. But anyhow, that's the way it is. I want to say that the will of God for your life, viewer comment, maybe it's God's wanting to share his will with you, Bob. But, I am not against at all the idea that God might act. Oh, the call, the phone call. Yeah, it's actually somebody I have to meet with tomorrow morning. And they may be calling to either cancel or to ask me to do something else or change the time. Well, I'll give them a call later. Anyhow, as we come to these various things in our life, I do believe that God does have a will for you. I think it's God's will for you that, first of all, that you exist. I think it's God's will for you that you know love. I think it's God's will for you that you experience what it is to have a sense of purpose. And I think there's a lot of things in the Bible that it talks about that are God's will that in some ways very, very general ideas. But the idea that God has a specific will for your life, that there's something he wants you to do today. And it's got to be this, it's got to be in that way, include these people. I really don't believe that is even taught in the Bible. And I do believe that if God had any such will like that for you, you don't need to be looking for it. It's God's responsibility to interrupt you while you're busy living your life responsibly and to tell you what he wants to do. This is what I see in the Bible. Almost, people are doing what they're doing, and Jesus comes along and he says, hey, you fishermen, come along with me. The call comes, and they respond. They weren't looking for the call. The call comes to them. And this sort of thing. That's the way, if God does have anything specific for you to do, that's his problem, and he will solve it, and you don't have to be worrying about it. It's this attempt, perhaps even to be hyper spiritual, and it doesn't work. It leads you around in circles. It keeps the Christian community dumb, and it keeps us under control of an institution that is trying to make sure that it can seem to march society into its own congregation, which in the end is not really an appropriate goal. Anyhow, that's pretty much all the time we have. And I was glad we had an opportunity here to talk about the will of God, what it is, what it isn't. And it more has to do with his desires, what it is he would like to see. It has more to do with a sense of vision of what he would like to share with us. And, it hasn't even entered into our hearts and our minds what God has for those that love him. And not that it even needs to at this point in time. Just the mystery of it is sometimes good enough. But as you live your life, I want to encourage you to take it by the horns. Recognize this is your one shot at life. You don't know that you're going to come around again. And I'll be honest with you. We don't even know if our concepts about God are even accurate. Well, who knows? Maybe Greg Bray is even right. When you die, you're just gone. This could be your only shot at it. Are you going to handle it responsibly? Are you going to come at it with all that you are and take responsibility for it? looking at it, owning it as yours, and taking it as a loving opportunity to be you in a world that needs you. I hope that you would do that. Anyhow, that's all I got to say for tonight. I'm glad you participated in the way you did. And this is Bob Graves, the Unconventional Pastor. I'll see you again during the next show. You take care. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick around. Dr. Jones is going to be up on the stage in just a few minutes, and he's going to knock your socks off. Is it God's will for you to stick around and watch Dr. Jones's show? Does God want you to get his permission for everything? Come on, man, make a decision for yourself. This is going to be a lot of fun. Stay tuned.